Before the civilian Hummer even had time to become ordinary transportation, it became an attitude with headlights. In the 1990s, American showrooms were already drifting toward bigger SUVs, bigger grills, and bigger promises, and the decade's cultural weather favored loud confidence. Booming stock market optimism, a celebrity-obsessed media machine, and an appetite for products that looked like they could muscle their way through anything. Into that landscape rolled a vehicle that seemed to have been designed specifically to ignore the concept of inside voice. The civilian Hummer did not blend in, did not apologize, and did not pretend to be practical in the way polite cars are practical. It looked like military hardware taking a joyride on public roads, and that theatrical excess, combined with its price, its fame, and its sheer physical dominance, helped turn it into a shorthand symbol for brashness in the 1990s American auto industry. The kind of brashness that equated size with power, attention with success, and intimidation with cool. In the late 1970s, the U.S. Army decided it had outgrown the classic Jeep. It wanted something tougher, wider, and more versatile. Something that could haul gear, scramble over rough ground, and keep moving when roads were more suggestion than reality. The result was a set of requirements so ambitious they read like a wish list written by someone who had just watched a truck commercial and taken it personally. Those requirements became the High Mobility Multi-Purpose Wheeled Vehicle Program, and in the early 1980s, AM General won the contract. The resulting machine, the Humvee, looked like it had been designed by an engineer with a ruler, a squared-off sense of humor, and an allergy to subtlety. It was a product of military logic, easy to service, hard to kill, and shaped like a brick, because a brick does not waste time on curves. The Humvee quickly became a fixture of American military power on television screens. It served as the backdrop for news footage, documentaries, recruitment imagery, and eventually the kind of popular storytelling that turns hardware into legend. The 1990 to 1991 Gulf War amplified that effect, placing the vehicle in the public eye as a rolling symbol of brawn and capability. Even people who couldn't name the manufacturer could recognize the silhouette: wide stance, flat sides, upright windshield, like a piece of industrial design that had wandered into the realm of icons. AM General had already toyed with the idea of selling a civilian version by the late 1980s, because once people see a vehicle that appears capable of driving directly over their problems, they tend to wonder if it can also drive to the mall. There was also something deeply American about the impulse. If the military has a tool that looks unstoppable, surely a private citizen should be allowed to buy one for the commute, preferably with cup holders. AM General's civilian plan was straightforward. Keep the same structure and most of the same mechanical parts, because the whole point was that it was the real thing. Then sand down the rough edges just enough to pass as something you could legally register. The civilian trucks were finished in automotive gloss paint instead of camouflage, but even that shine couldn't disguise their essential personality. Passenger car enhancements were added like polite accessories pinned onto combat boots. Air conditioning, sound insulation, upgraded upholstery, stereo systems, wood trim, and convenience packages. It was like putting a tie on a heavyweight boxer and asking him to mind his manners, except the boxer still weighed several tons and took up most of the room. One of the loudest voices pushing this idea belonged to Arnold Schwarzenegger. While filming Kindergarten Cop in Oregon, he saw an army convoy and became an enthusiastic lobbyist for a street-legal Humvee. It was a very on-brand moment. The era's most famous action star saw an intimidating vehicle and decided the public should have access to it too, as if making it available were simply the next logical step in the story. He campaigned for the idea with the persistence of someone used to getting the last word in a scene, and AM General listened. In 1992, it began selling a civilian version of the M998 Humvee under a new brand name, Hummer. The first two H1s sold went to Schwarzenegger, which was the sort of marketing campaign that didn't require much explaining. If a movie star known for playing unstoppable characters wants your truck, the truck's entire personality writes itself. It arrives pre-mythologized, already halfway to becoming a prop in its owner's public identity. The original Hummer, later called the H1, entered the market like a parade float that had escaped from a military base. It was expensive, unapologetic, and wildly capable off-road. The kind of machine that made ordinary 4x4s look like they were asking permission. It had the architecture of its military sibling, and the stance to prove it, with a width that communicated dominance before the engine even started. Off pavement, it could do things that seemed almost unfair, climbing, wading, and crawling with a kind of stubborn competence. On pavement, it could be less charming, in the way that a rhinoceros is less charming in a china shop. Steering, parking, lane positioning, all the normal social graces of driving were not its strongest interests. But the point wasn't refinement. The point was presence. In the 1990s, American auto industry, sport utility vehicles were booming, and size was often treated as a virtue in its own right. Big was safe, big was powerful, big was prosperous. Hummer took that idea and turned it up until the dial snapped off. It became the automotive equivalent of wearing sunglasses indoors. Not necessary, not subtle, and entirely the idea. The vehicle's physicality was its pitch. It did not need to be the quickest or the quietest. It needed to be unmistakable. It was a kind of purchase that announced itself before the driver stepped out, and that was the real product being sold alongside the sheet metal. That cultural role only grew as the decade rolled along. Hummer arrived at exactly the right time to become a symbol of confidence, of conspicuous consumption, of a certain loud American optimism that believed bigger problems could be solved by building bigger machines. To fans, it was a celebration of capability and toughness, the closest thing to driving a military legend without enlisting. To critics, it was a rolling argument against fuel economy and spatial awareness, a statement that the world's resources existed to be converted into noise and forward motion. It attracted admiration and resentment in almost equal measure, and both reactions kept it in the spotlight. Either way, it was impossible to ignore, and that kind of attention is catnip to major automakers who understand that controversy is often just another form of brand awareness. General Motors took notice. By the late 1990s, GM could see that Hummer had achieved something rare. It wasn't merely a vehicle, it was a character. In December 1999, GM bought the Hummer brand name from AM General, while AM General continued building vehicles under contract. GM became responsible for marketing and distribution of civilian Hummers, and soon reorganized the lineup in a way that made the brand easier to scale. The original vehicle became the H1, still rooted in military design and still built by AM General until it was discontinued in 2006. GM then widened the family with new models meant to bring more people into the fold. People who liked the idea of a Hummer but also liked fitting into parking garages and making turns without negotiation. The first and most important expansion was the H2, introduced for the 2003 model year and built by AM General under contract from GM. The H2 was still huge, still squared off, still proud of itself, but it was designed around more conventional civilian market components. It was a Hummer that had spent some time in public, learning how to interact with ordinary roads while maintaining the posture of a vehicle that would rather be conquering something. GM's strategy was not to tame the Hummer so much as to domesticate it, keep the look, keep the intimidation factor, add comfort and everyday usability, and put it in front of buyers who wanted the vibe without quite so much raw military seriousness. The strategy worked. In 2003, GM sold 34,529 H2s in the U.S., compared to just 730 H1s. Those numbers made the business case as clear as the H2's hood line was tall. It was the difference between a niche spectacle and a scalable product, and it proved that Hummer could be more than a novelty for deep-pocketed enthusiasts. Dealerships leaned into the militarized theme, sometimes featuring oversized half-Quonset hut-style roofs, as if customers were purchasing not just a vehicle, but also a tiny personal annex of the armed forces. Even the retail experience suggested the buyer was joining a club. Part off-road fantasy, part pop culture performance, part hardware store for ego. Hummer's popularity made it visible everywhere, and visibility has a way of breeding imitation. Clubs sprang up. Owners talked about approach angles and trail capability, but they also talked about being noticed at stoplights. The trucks became common sightings near upscale restaurants, outside gyms, and in entertainment districts, places where cars are rarely just transportation. Stretch limousine builders also discovered that nothing says special occasion like turning a Hummer into a rolling nightclub. The H2, in particular, was cut and extended into long, extravagant limo configurations that could carry crowds of passengers, proving that the vehicle's core identity, bigness as spectacle, could be stretched literally as well as figuratively. The brand's success also fed its image in ways GM could not fully control. By the early 2000s, Hummer wasn't only an off-road tool, it was a celebrity accessory, a statement parked at the curb. It was also increasingly a lightning rod. Critics pointed to the vehicle's sheer size, their visibility challenges, and their poor fuel economy. The H2's thirst became one of its most famous traits, and not in a flattering way. As gas prices rose and public conversation about environmental impact grew louder, Hummer became shorthand for automotive excess. The kind that could feel triumphant in an era of cheap gas and less triumphant when filling the tank started to feel like financing a small hobby. If the 1990s had taught America to equate big with bold, the mid-2000s began reminding everyone that bold could be expensive at the pump, socially awkward in tight spaces, and politically inconvenient when the culture shifted. GM kept pushing the more people, more Hummer idea anyway because the market for SUVs was still substantial and the brand still had gravitational pull. In 2005, the H3 arrived as the smallest member of the lineup, produced by GM in Shreveport, Louisiana, alongside the Chevy Colorado and GMC Canyon on a related platform. It was still unmistakably a Hummer, blocky, upright, and ready to impersonate a bank vault, but it fit into garages more easily and aimed for buyers who wanted the Hummer identity without the full-size burden. The H3 was, in many ways, a compromise with reality. Smaller footprint, more mainstream origins, and a price point that opened the door to customers who previously could only admire from afar. GM also experimented with variations and concepts, including the open-air HX concept in 2008, which teased a leaner, more playful direction the brand might have taken if the world had cooperated. There was also a strange, revealing undercurrent of reinvention attempts. Razor Technologies developed a plug-in hybrid prototype based on the H3, a sign that even then the idea of electrifying a Hummer had entered the conversation, as if the brand's greatest weakness was also its most obvious opportunity. But the Hummer's public reputation had momentum of its own, and momentum is hard to steer. Meanwhile, the brand cultivated off-road credibility through motorsport. Team Hummer Racing began in 1993 under off-road racer Rod Hall and competed in stock classes, stacking up production class wins at the Baja 1000. That racing story mattered because it gave the brand a claim to authenticity. The Hummer was not just a fashion statement. It could, when asked, back it up in punishing conditions. For enthusiasts, that ability justified the size and the compromises. For skeptics, it only reinforced the idea that the vehicles were built for an extreme lifestyle most owners would never actually live. In the popular imagination, the Hummer was always doing something dramatic, even when it was simply idling in traffic like everyone else. Hummer's reach extended beyond the United States. By 2006, Hummers were being exported and sold through importers and distributors in 33 countries. GM began producing the H3 at its Port Elizabeth plant in South Africa for international markets, starting with left-hand drive and later adding right-hand drive versions for Australia and other regions. The H2 was also assembled in Kaliningrad, Russia by Avtotor beginning in 2006, though in small numbers, largely limited to local consumption. In places far from American highways, the Hummer still communicated the same message, an export of American audacity, a rolling chunk of cultural attitude that took up space and acted as though it had every right to do so. Then the world changed in the ways that tend to make large, thirsty vehicles feel less like trophies and more like liabilities. Higher oil prices squeezed demand for big SUVs, and the late 2000s economic downturn tightened wallets. A brand that depended on indulgence suddenly looked vulnerable. On June 3rd, 2008, one day before GM's annual shareholder meeting, GM CEO Rick Wagoner publicly said the Hummer brand was being reviewed and might be sold, redesigned, or discontinued. The announcement had the uneasy tone of someone admitting that a party guest who was once the life of the room had become expensive to host. Interest flickered from potential buyers, including companies abroad, but interest alone does not keep assembly lines humming. By 2009, GM was actively exploring options, and Hummer, once a symbol of unstoppable momentum, was suddenly a question mark on a balance sheet. When GM entered bankruptcy proceedings in 2009, the company announced on June 1st that Hummer would be discontinued, then quickly pivoted to say it had reached a deal to sell the brand. The buyer was identified as Sichuan Tengzhong Heavy Industrial Machinery Company, a Chinese firm whose interest in a famously American gas guzzler felt like a plot twist written by the global economy. Deadlines were set, extended, and discussed. A reported price tag of $150 million drifted through the story like a figure pinned to the wall with a hopeful thumbtack. But the deal ultimately collapsed in February 2010 amid approval hurdles and market realities, and the brand's prospects dimmed further as consumer demand remained weak. GM said it would consider offers for all or part of the assets, and other interested parties surfaced. But those efforts also fizzled. In April 2010, GM officially confirmed it was shutting down the Hummer brand and offered hefty rebates to move remaining vehicles, an unglamorous clearance sale ending for a name that had once practically shouted from the rooftops. The last acts arrived quietly. After fulfilling a rental car fleet order, the final Hummer H3 rolled off the line at Shreveport on May 24, 2010. Dealerships began closing, and the distinctive Quonset hut roofs became architectural souvenirs of a recent era. Hummer's original run was over. It had risen from military legend to pop culture emblem, expanded into a full lineup, sold strongly at its peak, and then found itself on the wrong side of a changing economy and a shifting public mood. The brand that once seemed built for permanence learned the same lesson as many icons. History loves drama, but markets love practicality. And practicality tends to show up when the bill arrives. And yet, Hummer's story did not end so much as pause, like a loud character exiting a room while promising to return. In the late 2010s, as off-road enthusiasm surged and electric technology became the industry's new frontier, rumors began to circulate that GM might revive the name. The culture had swung again, and the market had made room for big off-road machines that were framed less as wasteful indulgences and more as adventurous lifestyle tools. At the same time, electrification offered a way to reclaim the spectacle without the same kind of fuel-burning stigma. GM invested heavily in retooling its Detroit Hamtramck facility for electric trucks and SUVs, and by 2020, the company officially brought Hummer back. Not as a standalone brand, but as a model under GMC. The reborn nameplate emerged as the GMC Hummer EV, an electric pickup, and an SUV slated for the 2022 model year, with pre-production beginning in late 2021 after a multi-billion-dollar investment in the plant. It was a fittingly modern twist. The original Hummer had been a civilian translation of a military machine, raw capability, dressed in just enough comfort to mingle with regular traffic. Its return flipped the script, a high-tech electric flagship wearing the old name as a kind of wink to history, keeping the visual bravado while swapping the fuel-burning reputation for a new kind of power. Whether that counts as redemption, reinvention, or simply the automotive industry's talent for sequels depends on the storyteller. But in chronological terms, the arc remains unusually clean. Hummer began as wartime hardware turned street spectacle, became a booming market celebrity and a cultural symbol of brash 1990s and early 2000s excess, then disappeared when that excess stopped feeling fun. Years later, it returned newly electrified, proving that in the car business, even the loudest exits sometimes leave the door open behind them, and even the most controversial icons can come back with different batteries in their belly and the same swagger in their stance.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 1 lines on X, we're here just for you.